هديتنا و- وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب يا من اسمه دواء وذكره شفاء وطاعته غناء يا حي يا قيوم يا من لا إله إلا أنت. فأما بعد, respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I extend my condolences to all of you during these days of Muharram, in which we come together to commemorate the martyrdom of the Prophet's grandson, Imam al-Hussein, and his companions and the family members of the best of creation, the Prophet of Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Holy Prophet, Hazrat Muhammad al-Mustafa, sallallahu alayhi wa ala alih. This betrayal points to a number of key deviations within the Islamic tradition. One of these deviations is the abandonment of an ethical process and an ethical commitment within governance. One portion of this is the forgetfulness of individuals with respect to their responsibilities in this world and the accountability with which they will be held to account in the hereafter. Another is the forgetfulness and betrayal of the love of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, the clear verses from the Quran which point to, and the narrations which point to the centrality of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wassalam as not only paragons and continuations of the prophetic nur, but as also the guardians of the inner and outer realities of this religion. It is for this reason that the commemoration of Ashura and the month of Muharram is not reflection upon a historical occurrence. It is a reminder and a retelling and a realization of a timeless reality. And that is the distinction between truth and falsehood, the distinction between justice and injustice, the distinction between loyalty and truthfulness on one side, and deviance and destructiveness and destruction on the other side. And when we come together and when we reflect upon the way that these events unfolded and the agony and the heartbreak with which the household of the Prophet in general and Hazrat Imam Hussein salamullah alayhi in particular was betrayed not from the side of non-believers and disbelievers, but from those individuals who claim to be Muslim, those individuals who were reciting in the azan that I testify that Muhammad is God's messenger, who in their prayers were saying, and peace be upon Muhammad and his family. And anyone who does not send blessings upon the Prophet and his family in prayer, according to all of the madahib of Islam, whether you're Shafi'i, whether you're Maliki, whether you're Hanafi, whether you're Hanbali, whether you're Ithna Ashari, whether you're Zaydi, whether you're Ismaili, Bora, doesn't matter. Ibadi, all of the madahib in Islam insist that the recital of the salawat in the section of julus and tashahhud is a necessity for the validity of that prayer. It is these individuals who raised their swords, who pointed their arrows, who directed their spears and their anger and viciousness, and brutally murdered in the most vicious of ways the grandson of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, who makes clear that I rise not to cause discord or disruption. I rise not desiring political power, but I rise in order to bring about correction to the ummah of my grandfather. Oftentimes Muslims ask the question, why are we so lost? How is it possible for Muslims, irrespective of the excuses that they may put forward, how is it possible for Muslims to witness the devastation And the word genocide no longer serves the reality of what has been happening to the people of Palestine. The word genocide is impotent when it comes to the horrors and the terror and the evil that is being directed to the people of Palestine. The schemes that have been plotted and have unfolded upon the people of Lebanon, who many Muslims conveniently forget because they are Shi'i. The schemes and the devastations that were planned and have unfolded in Syria, which most Muslims have turned their back to, as Alawi women are being stolen and turned into sex slaves, as Christians are being murdered, as Shi'is are being murdered. The devastations that have happened in Yemen, the violence that was directed to Iran, and the schemes that they have planned, the devastations and the horrors that are being unfolded upon the innocent people of the Sudan, funded by the United Arab Emirates. But as long as Muslims get to go on fancy vacations and purchase gold and take pictures in these nice dining halls of restaurants and cafes and luxury shops and cars and high-rise buildings, then we think that we are good Muslims. We are willing to overlook much in order to continue to console ourselves to the depth of our moral and ethical awareness. And this is exactly what it is. Just like people who come together and point violence and terror upon the grandson of their own prophet and the family of their own prophet and the followers of their own prophet, that same prophet who has said, Husaynu minni wa ana min Husayn. Hussein is of me and I am of Hussein. This is sometimes difficult for some individuals to understand. They say, well, maybe there was a political disagreement that unfolded. Maybe that's what the issue was. And yeah, it's not convenient, but it is a historical event. And, you know, we don't really like Yazid. It's unfortunate. But this kind of mindset and this kind of interpretive lens, in fact, limits and flattens the reality of what unfolded. This is not a political disagreement. This is about the very soul and source and vision and standing of Islam. What does Islam represent? What does Islam call for? What does Islam require from us? And who has betrayed not just the outer components of Islam, but the inner realities of Islam? Husaynu minni wa ana min Husayn, this narration of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, which has been widely reported in the books of our Sunni brothers and sisters, in the books of our Shi'i brothers and sisters, and there is no denying the validity of this narration. Well, it's common for someone to say that my grandson is of me, my progeny is of me. This is not a very surprising thing. But what does it mean when a grandfather says that I am also of him? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, بَلْ هُمْ عَنْ ذِكْرِ رَبِّهِمْ مُعْرِضُونَ بَلْ هُمْ عَنْ ذِكْرِ رَبِّهِمْ مُعْرِضُونَ. Verily, they are a people whom the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been abandoned from their hearts. And it is this destructiveness of the forgetfulness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the hearts of people that leads them not just into the realm of disbelief, but into the realm of deviation. The events of Karbala and the example of the sacrifice and the call of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh is exactly what we need in the year 2025, in the month of July, in the climate, and under the threats that you and I are facing and have faced, and the Palestinians are facing and have faced, the Sudanese are facing and have faced, the Lebanese are facing and have faced. the Yemenis, the Syrians, the people of Afghanistan, the people of Iran, the people of Kashmir, the Rohingyas, the Uyghurs. Why do we ignore all of this? Because they have divided us into these silos and into these clusters. And they have told us that it is okay to ignore the suffering of others, that it is okay to bring about sophistry in order to convince yourself that clear injustice is in fact not injustice. It's more complicated than that. All of these are signs, and all of these are a result of people who have forgotten the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not simply a verbal attestation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, يَقُولُونَ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ مَا لَيْسَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ. They say with their tongues that which does not reside in their hearts. There are many individuals who verbally mention the name of God, but in whose hearts there is no reality of that zikr. The month of Muharram is a month of the revival of our hearts. It is a month of mourning. There's no doubt in that. There's a narration of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, which says that in the morning of the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh, there is a certain intensity and fire in the heart of the believers that never subsides. And this is a sign of Iman, to have unwavering love to Imam al-Hussein, because the Prophet had unwavering love for Imam al-Hussein. The beloved of the Prophet is the beloved of God. This is clear to understand. And it is not simply enough to verbally attest to this love. We must understand the call of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh. What was it that he was asking? And what was it that he was pointing to less than 62 years after the passing of the Prophet? Muslims are very ignorant when it comes to the realities of our history. What occurred 62 years after the passing of the Prophet, that the grandson of the Prophet is denied water and he is brutally martyred? A 6-month-old great-grandson of the Prophet is pierced with an arrow. The blessed body of the grandson of the Prophet is cut into pieces, and horses are run across his body. Do Muslims not understand this? Do Muslims really think that Muharram is a month in which we say Happy New Year? Are Muslims this ignorant? Have they not studied the history of Islamic literature? If you study classical Islamic literature, there is no reference to Muharram being a source or a beginning of any joy. Muharram has always been understood in the Islamic sources as being connected to the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh, whether those were Sunni sources or whether those were Shi'i sources. If you look at the classic poetry in all of the Islamic languages, whether it is Persian, whether it is Arabic, whether it is Urdu, whether it is Turkish, you will see that when there are references to Muharram, it is always connected to the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh. Do you really think that we are living in a day and age in which Muslim scholars, so-called Muslim scholars, are not intentionally deviating and erasing the realities of Islamic history because it is uncomfortable or because of political machinations? I mean, if you really think that this is the case, I have a bridge to sell you. But we refuse to understand this. And the month of Muharram, and these nights especially, are times of reflection. There's times of awakening, of questioning, of reflecting, of asking, of challenging, of probing, of seeing the socio-economic, political, and spiritual conditions that our communities and our societies and countries of origin are mired in. and asking ourselves, how is it that this vibrant religion, that this beautiful example of the Prophet, that this wisdom, this refinement, this ethical, political, economic, moral excellence that this religion calls us towards has been left impotent in these times? Why are our economies stagnant? Why are our communities filled with social ills? Why do we find ourselves so polarized? If you think that the answer is imperialism or communism or colonialism, you haven't understood and scratched beyond the surface. Yes, those things have had impact, but this issue goes deeper than that. If you are not shocked and rattled and shaken up by the fact that Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh was martyred in the most brutal of ways, and this is just another day for you, there's much to reflect. There's deep, deep issues to uncover. Because one of the things that the narrations mention is that on the day of judgment, people will be asked about their love of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. And this love, again, as the verse of the Quran says, يَقُولُونَ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ مَا لَيْسَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ. They utter with their tongues, they express with their tongues that which does not reside in their hearts. Tell them, O Prophet, the Quran mentions, tell them, O Prophet, that I do not ask of you any reward for this, meaning the delivery of the message, إِلَّا مَوَدَّةً لِلْقُرْبَى, except for mawadda, which is a consistent and generous and tender love for my household, the closest kin to me. Can someone be Muslim and have hatred? Or forget hatred. Can they have ambivalence towards the household of the Prophet? Can someone who knowingly murdered the one whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that say, if you do not believe us in the ayah of Mubahala, let us call our sons and your sons. And let us call our women and your women. And let us call our own selves and your own selves. And turn to God and ask of God that the one who is telling the lie be damned. When you look at the asbab al-nuzul of this ayah, for some of the sisters and some of the brothers, you notice that this was a challenge that the Christians of Najran brought to the Prophet because they refused his prophethood. And the Quran says that if you are actually true in what you say, then bring your folk, and we will bring our folk as well. And across the board, all of the Muslim mufassirin, when they refer to this ayah, they mention that the verse where it says, أَوْلَادَنَا, our children, our youth, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his, brought two individuals with him. Who are these two individuals? Imam al-Hasan and Imam al-Hussein. Were there no other youth amongst the Muslim community? There were. But the excellence of Imam al-Hasan and Imam al-Hussein is something else. That's why in all of the khutbahs of our Sunni brothers and sisters, they have a narration of the Prophet that they repeat. Alas, and how unfortunate is it that many individuals have not reflected on what this narration is actually saying, what it's actually calling towards. Al-Hasan wal-Hussein, Sayyida Shabab Ahl al-Jannah. Hasan and Hussein are the masters of the youth of paradise. Have we reflected and understood that there are no elders in paradise? That everyone is a youth in paradise? Can it be possible that the people who murdered and martyred one of the masters of the youth of paradise is a Muslim? Do you understand this? Do you understand that in Saudi there are roads named after the murderer of the grandson of the Prophet, that there are people who claim to be Muslims who attempt to offer explanations as to what happened? That this was just a political disagreement and it got out of control? Really, this is how we're going to understand, and this is how we're going to respond to the Prophet and to God on the day of judgment, that this was just a political misagreement? Sayyida Shabab Ahl al-Jannah, the grandson of the Prophet, Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh, elsewhere is referred to as Misbah al-Huda. He is the lantern of guidance, وَصَفِينَةُ النَّجَاةِ, and that voyage of safety and salvation. You and I have been invited in this sacred month for a reason to grow and to illuminate our hearts with the lessons and illumination from the school of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh, the one who watered and preserved the reality of Islam with his sacred blood, who showed with his words and in action what true dedication and loyalty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to the path of his Prophet actually mean. And you and I are faced with a question that Muharram asks of us year after year. Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh says openly and clearly, I mentioned this and I have been mentioning this for years. One of the reasons that many withhold and erase the realities of Muharram and Karbala is because once a society and once a people understand the realities of Muharram and Karbala, they will never allow oppressors to rule over them. The Imam salamullah alayhi says, Ayhat min al-dhillah, never to humiliation. A believer, a person with a conscience and an ethic, never surrenders and submits to the yoke and to the oppression of the unjust. They realize that life under injustice is worse than death. And we have been created to be free, to be in the loving worship of our Creator, to celebrate and to experience the love and the mercy of His Prophet, of the household of His Prophet, to blossom and to bloom with all of the nascent potentials and potentialities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed within us. But one way to remove the veils of ignorance and the veils of injustice and the veils and the zulumat on the spiritual realm is to grow in your love of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh. Allow me to mention and remind us of Hazrat Abbas, the standard bearer and the flag bearer of the household of the Prophet. They say that when these oppressors and these unjust demons had cut off water from the household of the Prophet, it had been days that Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayh and the children of the household of the Prophet and the women folk of the household of the Prophet had access to water, just like we see today that these demons deny water and food and baby formula to innocent Palestinians, and then they shoot them and they gun them down and they laugh about it. They say that the children asked their uncle Hazrat Abbas, Abul Fadl Abbas, can you bring us some water? And he makes the promise to them that he will bring them some water. The enemy had cut off access to water, and thousands of soldiers had encircled the tents of the household of the Prophet. They say Hazrat Abbas breaks through and reaches the water and grabs an amount of water in his blessed hand, having endured days of thirst in the scorching desert of Karbala. He looks at the cool, sparkling water and wants to drink it just like any of us would want to drink water when we are not just thirsty, but imagine if you're completely dehydrated and on the verge of collapse. But as he brings this water close, he recalls and remembers that Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi is still thirsty, that the children of the household of the Prophet are still thirsty. He drops this water and says, I cannot drink while Imam al-Hussein is thirsty, while the children are thirsty. He takes the mashk and he gets on his horse and starts to go towards the camp of the household, and it is then that the enemy begins to attack him. And Abbas, who was known to be a fierce warrior as the son of Asadullah, Hazrat Ali, Amirul Mu'mineen, who never lost in battle and who never turned his back in battle, and who never struck anyone who had turned in battle. They say that some of the enemy were hiding in the orchards in the Nakhlistan, and one of them jumps and strikes the right arm of Hazrat Abbas. They say that Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam grabs the sword and moves it to his left hand and continues to fight and is holding the mashk between his blessed teeth. A bit longer, someone comes and strikes his left hand, and Hazrat Abbas salamullah alayhi still is on the horse, still refusing to let go of the water that he wants to deliver to the household of the Prophet. It is then that they say that one of these mal'ooneen struck the blessed head of Hazrat Abbas. And Hazrat Abbas salamullah alayhi, who has also had his blessed eye pierced by an arrow, falls to the ground. They say that Hazrat Abbas never called Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi by his name. He always referred to him as the Imam. They say that as he is falling, he calls out to Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi by his name, O brother. Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi rushes to Hazrat Abbas. They say as Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi is holding the blessed body of Hazrat Abbas, the Imam sheds tears and says, Al-ana ankasara dhaharak. Now my back has been broken. The children are awaiting water. Abbas alayhi salam has become martyred. The flag of the household of the Prophet has lost its standard bearer. They say that the mother of Hazrat Abbas, al-Baneen, who was not present in Karbala, they say when the news of the martyrdom of her sons reaches her, she begins to cry and she begins to say, do not call me al-Baneen. I do not have any sons left. And she asks, I have heard that my Abbas was carrying the mashk of water between his teeth. Why was he doing that? Why would anyone carry water between their teeth? Where were the hands of Abbas? Where were the hands of Abbas? وَلَعْنَةُ اللَّهِ عَلَى الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وجميع الشهداء ورحمة الله وبركاته. I extend my condolences to all of the believers, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to elevate your states, to illuminate your hearts, to strengthen you in your love of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, and your commitment to justice. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect all of the oppressed people throughout the world and to grant victory to the oppressed over the oppressor. And our school is the school of Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi, and our commitment is always to justice and the repetition of the words of our Imam, ayhat min ad-dillah, never to humiliation and never to surrender to the unjust. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.